Okay. All right. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us this evening as we do this panel seminar on sustainability reporting and commercial law. We're using microphones. It's slightly fuzzy, isn't it? But we're using microphones because we're online as well. So that's why we need the mic. I realise that sounds a bit better if it's not right up. So we'll just check, and we've got someone monitoring Q&A in the webinar as well, and we are recording this session. So before I start, let me introduce myself and then acknowledge traditional owners and introduce our panel and our topic. So I'm Miranda Stewart. I'm currently acting director of the Melbourne Centre for Commercial Law. Our chair in the program, Professor Rosemary Langford's unfortunately indisposed. But she and I have been working together, putting together this panel for some time. So I'm sure she knows more about it than I do. I'm mostly a tax law person, but I'm very interested in learning a lot. And as I'll ask later on, this concept of ESG plus T seems to keep coming up. So maybe tax has something to do with it as well. So I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose traditional lands this law school is based, and all of our learning and education activities take place on this land, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So the topic of our panel, well, we had a bit of a discussion about the title. Sustainability reporting sounds a little narrow because it's kind of just about reporting. Sustainability, just the word on its own, sounds like it could be everything, but on the other hand, maybe is the most useful way to go. ESG, of course, is this sort of acronym du jour about that reporting process, that idea of environmental, social and governance obligations, or else market metrics, or something that tells us something extra, I guess, about investment or what corporations are doing or aiming to do. So we thought we would try to explore this topic in this panel from a few different perspectives as a kind of cross-cutting topic, if you like, in the area of commercial law. This fits with, I guess, the goals of the Centre for Commercial Law, which brings together these different research programs. At the moment we have a range of people working across all areas of what you could call commercial law, but we have sort of four main research programs in the centre: corporate law, financial regulation, of course, Rosemary essentially in that area, Andrew Godwin also in the room, tax law and policy, something I do, construction law, and also commercial arbitration, a lot of construction there too. We have Matthew Bell and Wayne Jockick in the room here, and consumer law as well. And one of the other motivating factors for this seminar has been that we've had a great time this semester with some interns. We've had some legal interns in the centre doing some research for us on a background paper about sustainability. So we've got Ben, Matthew, Pinadu and Sam in the room. Thank you very much for that. And Ben's going to be monitoring our webinar Q&A. So just to note that for those online, please feel free to just put any questions you have in the Q&A. We're going to go through the session and take some questions as we go through among the panel, some discussion as well as at the end. So let me, with that, introduce my panel, and I'll just go to their bios because they have rather illustrious histories and experience. So to my right, Professor Rosemary Addis, currently an Enterprise Fellow at the Centre and Professor at the Faculty of Business and Economics here at the University of Melbourne. And Rosemary is really widely recognised for her role as a director and a strategist of companies, especially in areas of innovation and sustainability. So I'm hoping Rosemary can tell us what that means, because I still struggle to really understand what we mean by that term, or how best to use it, how most usefully to use that term, and also what the law and the standards are now requiring companies to do. Rosemary is a founding managing partner of a number of funds and organisations, Mondial Impact, and serves on various advisory groups, and was for many years a senior equity partner at Allens Linklaters. She's also done a lot of work for governments around the world. In fact, she's just come back from London. I didn't quite get what you're doing in London, what you were doing, visiting the Centre for Transnational Law, the university there. So to Rosemary's right, we have another colleague of mine, Dr. Brad Jessup, senior lecturer here, who is an innovator in this area of business and the environment. Brad is a director of the Melbourne Centre for Law and the Environment, and particularly works on law, environment and society. He teaches torts, so liability is a big issue in this space, environmental and clinical subjects, including the Sustainability Business Clinic. So I think Brad brings a very particular approach and informative knowledge about what we mean by sustainability in that context. I'm sure if you're interested in knowing more about that clinic, Brad can explain that too. Previously, he had experience in private sector as an environmental lawyer in Herbert Smith Freehills. And at the end, Andrew Mills, who I've known for a long time. I guess I think of Andrew mostly as a tax person, but it seems now he has other hats. He works more broadly in areas of financial reporting and supervision. So he's a principal fellow with us here at the Centre and chair of the Financial Reporting Council. Also a member of the Board of Taxation. So both of these bodies affiliated with the Treasury and associated with these kinds of reporting and kind of policy roles. Andrew, when I first met him, was working for, I think, Greenwoods and Freehills for many years as a director at Specialist Tax, but also has a long career, senior career at the Taxation Office and former president of the professional body, the Tax Institute. And has held many other CEO and C-suite roles. So I think the panel is really, really well placed to say something, to tell us something about sustainability and reporting. We don't have slides, so it's going to be a fairly informal thing. I'm going to go to Rosemary first, have you say something about how we should understand this important issue. And then we'll come to some questions and then the panelists. But if people in the room have questions, please feel free to sort of raise your hand and we can manage that as we go. Thank you. So to Rosemary, and let's make sure your mic is on.
I think so.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Sounds good.
Great. Well, welcome everybody. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we're meeting on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And thanks to both Rosemary Langford and to Miranda for bringing us together. And I'm hoping we can set the stage for tonight's conversation. As Miranda said, I wear a number of hats, and I come at these subjects very much from the perspective that everything we do has an impact, positive, negative, intended, unintended, and for a long time in particularly commercial areas, we've been arguably overemphasising some of the financial aspects, and how do we now build in a more holistic picture of performance and accountability. I'm hoping today I'll give you a brief Cook's tour of today's topic, and then I know my colleagues Andrew and Brad will build on that, and we want to very much, as Miranda said, make this a conversation with all of you, including those online. I want to talk a little bit about what's changing and why this conversation is growing in relevance and focus for organisations, and then also put that in the perspective of a broader context that sometimes gets a bit lost as we focus in on the reporting and compliance aspects. So, as many of you will know, reporting on social and environmental issues or sustainability issues, we can characterise it a number of ways, is not entirely new in Australia. People have been engaging with this for a long time through mechanisms like the Global Reporting Initiative, the Climate Disclosures Initiatives, and more recently the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So there's been a number of regimes of voluntary reporting that have been operating for a while, and a significant number of Australian companies have engaged with that. There's also global benchmarks that have developed, things like the CDP, but also the World Benchmarking Alliance that in recent years, and they're quite public about their methodologies and how they're looking at the performance of a range of companies around the world. So what's new in the Australian context is that from this year, for the first time, we've really got a more broadly mandated set of reporting. There has been reporting for some companies in emissions intensive industries, but now this is really the Australian government mandating the reporting of climate related risks and opportunities for a much broader range of organisations as part of the company's formal financial reporting. There's a bit of nuance to that, and I know that Andrew will cover some of the principles and other dimensions of the why and what of the reporting in his remarks, so I won't go too much into that. Other than to say this sits with the suite of formal reports that directors are now expected to sign off on, and it's phased in implementation, starting with larger organisations broadly equivalent to the ASX 200, and then moving into more medium-sized and organisations from there. And the same way that other financial reports link to the Australian accounting standards, this also links to the Australian accounting standards, the standard S2, which also links to the international frameworks that have developed, connected with the International Foundation for Reporting Standards, which is the basis of Australia's accounting principles, as many of you will know, and their work through the Sustainability Standards Board. So the requirements come into force for the larger companies from January this year and get phased in. And there's also a grace period, understanding that companies are going to need to build their capability around what they're reporting to really try and give a picture about the climate-related issues and opportunities that are going to affect their company. And there's some quite specific focus in the standards around things that might be expected to affect companies' cash flows, access to finance, cost of capital, and expectations around the types of things that will be disclosed. There's also assurance to come in behind this, again, very similar to what we expect in other areas, and that will be phased in with the intent to get things really up and running at a reasonable level of assurance of disclosures by the end of this decade. The focus on climate reflects the government's climate first approach to the way it's looking at regulation connected with its transition planning. There are different views around that, and I'll come back to that point in a minute. There's also an overlay around transparency of companies disclosing how they got to the kind of disclosures that they're making. But while the requirements include scenario analysis for different types of outcomes, they don't mandate which ones. And so these are some of the issues that I'm sure you'll hear about as we move into the discussion today that are causing some organisations a little bit of angst. And while there has been voluntary reporting for some time, this is a shift, and it reflects a number of things that have been going on globally that I think we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which it's a big shift in the way we think about organisations reporting on their performance and on the risks and opportunities that affect their performance and how they relate to society. And at the same time, it's a lag indicator. We're looking at what has been and companies' kind of projections forward, but it doesn't give us the whole picture. Some of my colleagues in the accounting department over the road at the Faculty of Business and Economics have tried to help the Australian Accounting Standards Boards and others get their head around the magnitude of the shift, and they looked at the voluntary reporting of the top 300 ASX companies recently. And to summarise very broadly, they found that there had been a number of organisations making disclosures. The level of extent of the analysis of that was relatively low, but it had been improving over time. And that as in other studies they've done, they have also seen that they're based on looking at the market price effects of the companies that are making disclosures. There does seem to be some correlation between the way investors are reacting to the information that's in the market, the level of sophistication relative to the sophistication, size and maturity of the companies. And they did find a clear upward trend in both the breadth and the depth of disclosures over time. With the introduction of mandatory reporting, we can expect that there is expected to be an increase in focus and a raising of the bar, including around decision usefulness of information that's coming into the market. And Andrew's going to talk a bit more about the use cases and who are really expected to use this kind of information. I wanted to highlight a few other dimensions that sometimes get a bit obscured by our focus on the parameters of the regulation and what's needed to comply. One of those is the broader legal and governance requirements. Directors, irrespective of the reporting requirements, obviously still have their duties of care and diligence. And as Justice Michelle Gordon said in the 2023 Harold Ford lecture, that some of the essential questions for directors and officers around the purpose of the organisation, the interests and issues to which they need to pay attention, the time horizons they need to be working with, those questions remain the same, but the way that they're assessed and the way that the directors are assessed in relation to fulfilling their duties does evolve over time, and new and different considerations are coming in, including that there be a broader lens, and that is something that is coming through in the international jurisprudence as well as here in Australia. And some of you will know that in some jurisdictions they've moved to actually legislate a broader lens. The UK, for example, in 2006 introduced a much clearer framing in their Companies Act that directors have a statutory duty to act in a way that they consider will promote not only the success of the company for the benefit of its members as a whole, but also considering the long-term consequences of decisions and their impact on the community and the environment. And the broader directors' duties obviously are not just about climate. Climate is an issue that is affecting not only the companies, but also the companies have an effect on the climate. But directors' duties are also needing to take into account a more holistic view of other dimensions affecting the company as well. We've seen the introduction of gender equality and the reporting about gender pay gaps, about modern slavery. And aside from those particular issues, when it comes to looking at how climate issues and other dimensions of the environment affect the company or the companies affecting those, what my colleagues and I find is that there's a clear interrelationship between the social and environmental. And as one of my colleagues says, you can't solve a Rubik's Cube one face at a time. And it really serves directors well to be understanding the multiple dimensions, because that's how you start to see what issues relate to one another, what issues relate most to our company, how do we act in the best interest of the company. And you can, it actually is helpful also because you can get out of the trap of thinking we have to be able to solve for every permutation and combination, because you actually start to build a more nuanced application of how it relates to the company's strategy. That said, the studies tell us that there's still a lot of boards and organisations out there where the executives are feeling ill-equipped to deal with these issues in terms of expertise, or how they integrate it into the way they think about strategy, compliance, forward planning, governance, in a way that they feel that they've built the muscle because they're so used to doing things in a different way, and it just doesn't work the same way if you bring it in as a separate issue. And so that's something that's going to be ongoing for quite a while. It's also worth noting that under the accounting standards, even prior to the introduction of climate reporting, directors need to sign off on accounts as being a true and fair representation of the company's position. And so aside from separate reporting, considering the information relating to social and environmental issues can be a factor. There has been an opinion in the UK under the True and Fair project around these issues. And there's also a set of guidance that has been developed for directors based on UK law, but I do think it's got some nice practical guidance that can actually help boards that are working through the process here as well. I wanted to touch briefly on the purpose of reporting because I know Andrew's going to talk more about this, but the reporting has generated a lot of new work for organisations, and we do find some organisations being quite preoccupied with that. And certainly in the work I do, I see a lot of focus on the compliance aspects. Built into the standards is a focus on strategy, governance, the type of information, and reporting. And that really is inviting much more of a management approach in the sense of integrating the information, asking so what, working together with users of the reports. And I think that's an incredibly important facet, and some work that my colleagues and I have been involved with has been around actually trying to set some of the management standards in the same way that accountants had to put the processes in place to manage for information. We still need to do that with the sustainability information as well. And it is part of good practice for boards to be challenging management, to think creatively about strategies, asking and interrogating the kind of information and what it means for strategy and for the way that they are working. And of course, it impacts also on the relationship between companies and their investors. The intent being, if information is going into the market to inform investors, that those investors might be acting on that, and how that relates to the companies. And our colleagues in the UK that have looked at how that's tracking have used the metaphor of a rocket and basically said, you know, stage one of the rocket, information landing in the market, seems to be working at least to some degree, as reporting and sustainability practices have some direct effects, even though they're relatively small. If we think of stage two of the rocket being whether that gets taken up, that it's temperamental and frequently misfires, causing the rocket to fall back to Earth, and stage three being that whether you're actually having an impact in the real world based on these interactions, that in their words, the launch remains the subject of little more than rumoured sightings. This is a work in progress, but I do want to end on the thought that that information alone is an advance in how we think about the requirements and performance, but alone it's not enough. That the organisations and how organisations actually fulfil their legal requirements is operating in a world where the boundaries are really shifting in the context of what will be a significant global industrial and economic transition over probably the next decade. And this is a moment where it will serve companies well to be proactive and thinking about what's going to build resilience, longevity, engage and be strategy-led, yes, responsive to the regulations, but to very much be focused on where are the opportunities for them to become more resilient, to differentiate in the market and to engage actively.
Thank you for those opening remarks. So please feel free to keep thinking about your questions. I've put my speakers in a slightly different order from my run sheet, so I'm going to go to Andrew after this. But I had a couple of questions for you and then possibly for others on the panel to consider at this point. The first, I guess, is just that maybe it's no longer the elephant in the room because we've had a week later from when we met. What does the election result mean? What do more difficult question trends in the US and Europe mean for sustainability, for these standards in Australia, but perhaps more generally as well?
So the good news for Australia is that, love or hate the election results, we have a period, probably not just of another term, but probably another 2 terms of some policy stability, which will actually give this a chance to work its way through the system and for organisations to get more used to it. It makes it less likely that it will be undone in the future. It gives Australia the luxury of relative policy stability here, and together with other countries like Canada, Japan, and the UK, to be able to work on developing these capacities. Certainly there is a lot of turbulence elsewhere in the world, but I think it is not, it's a matter of pace. It might affect how quickly we can move. It will slow some things down, but we can't fight the laws of nature and the laws of technology. The direction of change is clear, and Australian companies will be served well if they engage proactively with this. But there will be, in a global level, some headwinds as they do that.
I think that I can add, I think
It's your microphone.
I think it is on.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. I think the fascinating thing is that, and absolutely agree with what Rosemary's just said in terms of stability, it's great. But the fascinating thing is that people look to what's happening in the US or elsewhere. And they forget that in the US, for example, a lot of this isn't necessarily driven at the national level, it's actually driven at the state level. And when you're looking at somewhere like California, the 7th largest economy in the world, New York, and a number of other states that have signed up and actually will require reporting on climate. This as a starting point, and probably will continue to expand into broader sustainability things. This is not something that's going away, absolutely. Europe has pulled back a little bit, but Europe's pulled back in the sense of probably ensuring that the impacts, at least to start with, are only felt by the largest organisations. Their earlier iterations had a very broad impact, and even Australian companies trading into Europe were impacted by those rules. I think the only other aspect of Europe is to what level they will ultimately make some tweaks to align with the International Sustainability Standards Board approach to things. But sorry, I just felt I need to look at what's happening in the US, not from a national point of view, but from the state base as well.
Yeah, we'll take one quick question if you could now, and then we'll move on. So just to repeat, we heard that question well. It's a bit like this US, what about the President Trump approach apparently undoing these sorts of things at the national level? I might ask Rosemary, and then I might come to you, Andrew, and then you can proceed with your remarks.
Yeah, so I think the US at a national level, certainly they are pulling back. I think we will see some of the states hold the line though, because they've got so much economic that's built into it, and we may see them take a less regulatory-led approach, relying on the fact that they're building a lot of industries now where there's the incentives for people to engage in any event, in terms of just the scale of projects and the investment into some of the renewables and other infrastructures. So I think we'll see them play it on multiple dimensions.
Yeah, I think that.
So I might pass to Andrew anyway. Feel free to comment, and then I'll pass to you with your remarks as well.
I think that people don't appreciate the regulatory environment in the US, that a lot of things are actually not dealt with at the national level, but rather at the state level. Simple thing in financial services, if you want to run a bank in more than one state, you actually have to register and comply with each state's separate requirements. The same for insurance and a number of other things. So they have very strong state-based regulatory frameworks. And one of the reasons that people talk about registering in Delaware is because it's actually the lowest regulatory environment. Every other state has it, but you actually have to do multiple registrations for things. You actually have to comply with multiple regulatory framework obligations. And so at a national level, they can pull back, but the states continue to have a very different position to the way it would be here. And so let me put it to you this way, that our standard setters here continue to have discussions with the standard setters in California and New York and other places because they are still pushing ahead with things. And then so who am I? What the hell am I doing talking about this stuff? Yeah, so one of the things that Miranda and Rosemary asked me to talk about was who is the Financial Reporting Council, because they're not always well known. It is an agency that's constituted under Part 12 of the ASIC Act, along with the AASB, the Accounting Standards Setting Board, and as well as the Auditing Standards Setting Board. So it has this overarching role. It oversees the financial reporting framework. It ensures the transparency, accountability, alignment with international standards. Its primary responsibilities are, in fact, having an oversight monitoring role of those two standard setting boards, and advising the government on financial and sustainability reporting and auditing matters. It looks at audit quality. It's done specific work in relation to that. It looks at ethics training, and it's about promoting the adoption of high quality standards. It assesses the effectiveness of the whole process that the standard setters go through. It's very big on stakeholder engagement, so it does try to talk to all of the key parts of the financial framework, and by that I mean not only users of financial statements, but preparers of financial statements and other regulators. The basic reason for existence of these bodies is to ensure that there is in fact high quality information available to users and to the entities themselves, importantly. And I'll come back to that when we talk about sustainability, because all of this is about, even before taking into account sustainability, even when it was more focused on financial reporting, it was about ensuring that you had the best decisions made on the allocation of resources based on good information that was available. The ultimate aim of all of that is to ensure that Australian entities are able to compete internationally and have a lower cost of capital. And there has been academic research that says those that follow the internationally accepted standards tend to have lower costs of capital. So, talking about sustainability, as Rosemary has referred to, that this isn't new. There has been sustainability reporting in some way, shape or form for, well, I'm looking at over 30 years, and I sort of mark the time, the real starters, the 1992 UN Rio Earth Summit. That led to, there was reporting before that, and following that, not long after, of course, the GRI came out, but then that was a response to the Exxon Valdez disaster that some older people in the room will remember. Hopefully the younger people too. But that sort of had started this momentum of getting better reporting, and it was picked up by various jurisdictions in different ways. The group that came together perhaps was the voluntary framework called the TCFD, which was the Task Force for Climate-related Financial Disclosures. That in the mid-teens, it was chaired by a guy called Bloomberg, who you may have heard of. Michael Bloomberg, of course, the billionaire, but the creator of Bloomberg's in terms of financial reporting. So that's transmogrified in some ways into what we now have, which is the International Financial Reporting Framework, IFRS, establishing a separate board, the International Sustainability Standards Board, to sit alongside the International Accounting Standards Board. I'm happy to say that Australia is the first adopter of both mandatory accounting as well as mandatory sustainability reporting. I'd say, I'm pleased to say that that's in the sense of adopting the international frameworks. We weren't first out there, and I'll come back to New Zealand in a little bit. For my sins, I sit on the External Reporting Board of New Zealand as well, and they actually put out standards a couple of years earlier. That was as a result of the then government mandating in the late teens an obligation to go down this path of having reporting around sustainability, but in particular climate reporting. Looking at the why, this is very much, as I've said, this is about providing information that companies should disclose. But who are they disclosing it to? They're disclosing it to investors, to lenders, to insurers, and others who have an interest in the financial stake. But it's further than that. I think that there is an element of social license that goes with companies as well that they need to address. It may not be, if you like, the business driver in many ways, but one of the beauties I see of sustainability reporting is it actually forces companies to think longer term about their own sustainability and about how they're allocating resources. any organisation that has been reporting, as you mentioned, Rosemary, on the risks and opportunities, and which is a requirement under the corporations law, if you think about the operational and financial review the company's supposed to put out. Any company is meant to have actually been looking at all kinds of risks and opportunities, and there's no reason why that shouldn't have included sustainability and climate in particular for some time. Having said that, of course, many companies have been doing exactly that. IFAC reported earlier this week, so the International Federation of Accounting Bodies, had just done some research and they've reported that of publicly available information, a very high percentage in the 90s of companies have been reporting on climate for some time and continue to do so. The issue has been under what framework and are they comparable? And I think that that's where we are now in the process, that we have got to the point where the International Sustainability Standards Board has started putting out standards that we have now adopted. And they provide a consistency about the way reporting should occur. It's, if you look at the international standard, it goes further than the Australian standard in the sense that it actually has industry-based metrics that can be used. We haven't adopted those to maintain a level of flexibility, and in particular during the consultation process, that perhaps was the part that got the most pushback. But they still may well be a suitable area of guidance. We're talking about sort of, the comparability. There have been different regimes. The ASX corporate governance principles have required some level of reporting in relation to these things since 2019. And as this develops, we've got the standards that have started. We have the auditing standard that has just been approved earlier this year, ASA 5000, which again leverages off the international standard. All of these things are coming together. But importantly, what's having to chase this is I guess the further explanation. Already there are some guides, frequently asked questions, links to further detail that exist on the AASB website, for example. ASIC has issued its regulatory guide, RG 280. That's out there that provides another 70 or 80 pages of further information or explanation. There are training modules that have been pulled together with other related material that the AASB has prepared. But because we are so aligned internationally, they've actually given the opportunity for the international body to take a look at it, because there may well be that that's then picked up internationally as well. So there's a fair bit of ongoing work to help and assist companies adopt this. Back to what we're trying to achieve, as I mentioned, standardisation. No one argues that standardisation of financial disclosures shouldn't be the case, that has been the case for decades, and this is no different. It really is important for entities themselves to actually understand what they're doing, how they're doing it. Many companies have in fact moved to sustainability reporting, not necessarily just coming out of the shareholder engagement side of the business, but rather moving it under CFOs, because there are frameworks and there is discipline about the way in which reporting occurs for the financial side, and so they want to adopt similar kinds of approaches there as well. In terms, and so companies should be able to use this information in terms of their own decision making, their own allocation of resources, and investors will demand it. For those who are doing it and doing it well, they will set the benchmark, and people, investors, insurers, financiers will all ask other companies, why aren't you doing the same thing? And so that then goes to the rating and the cost of capital. But I'm going to finish on this because it is about risk. But I mentioned New Zealand, and in their climate standard that they put out, which is not necessarily internationally aligned as yet, but they're taking that on board. The difficulty with going out as the first person is that you don't have anything else to work with. But they speak about the the objective of the standard is to enable primary users to assess the merits of how entities are considering those risks, the climate risks and opportunities, and then make decisions based on these assessments. This is the one I love the most. The ultimate aim of the standards is to support the allocation of capital towards activities that are consistent with the transition to a low emissions, climate resilient future. They are very blatant about what they're trying to achieve, and that you won't find that elsewhere in other countries, but that really sets a standard to me. I'll stop there.
Oh, thanks very much, Andrew. And I just wanted to ask you a couple of follow-ups, and I'm not sure, Ben will wave at me if we've got a question for the panel. We might come back to that one for the panel a bit later. So I was thinking, given that you, in a sense, talk to the standard setters who then presumably consult and talk to the companies, is it too soon? Are you hearing anything about what is the biggest challenge for implementation, or where the difficulties are? Is it too soon to say?
Look, I think that one of the greatest difficulties is for those entities that are on the borderline of, I mean, if you're a Rio Tinto, a BHP, someone who isn't
You're already in
understand, you're in it, you understand it. The financiers have been in it, the bigger ones, they actually understand and have been dealing with it, the major banks and others. I think that the difficulty is for other entities that are not quite so obviously exposed to climate impacts and so on. They need to make an assessment, and they need to have reasonable factors. And I think that they're trying to determine, have I passed the point, and what do I need to do in order to work out, have I passed the point at which I need to get down into some more detail and report. Other companies that have been reporting on an NGES basis and other kinds of things that the federal government's had in place for a long time get it and understand it. They've been through that process. But people who are newer to this, I think, are still trying to work out, well, what is reasonable? What do I need to do to show that either I don't need to report, or how much do I need to report? So there are reasonableness standards that are still probably unclear on people are working with. That's the biggest thing I think I hear. Rosemary, if you would hear things too, no doubt.
Yeah, I think people are grappling with some of the ways of approaching it, and also because there's not prescribed, for example, ways to approach your scenario analysis. I think there are organisations that have, as you say, been doing this for a while, that have developed the sets of assumptions and things that are used, and others who are coming new to it are really trying to work through what that process should look like for them.
And while I've got you, Andrew, before we move on to Brad, because I know you with a tax hat on, and I know you also sit on the board of taxation, there's a few academic articles out there. There's actually also a couple of speeches from the tax office. I noticed Jeremy Hirschhorn, who's someone we both know, senior in the ATO, recently gave a speech to the Shareholders Association, saying basically ESG plus T, what should you be looking out for in investing in terms of tax disclosure, in terms of what the corporations are doing from a tax perspective, and are there risks you need to be aware of? Do you have a view about whether tax is part of this whole process, or are there other developments in the area?
Look, I have no doubt that it's part of ESG and could arguably fit into S or G pretty easily. The interesting thing in the tax space is that they're actually going through a similar kind of thing. So there's country by country reporting that companies have been, larger entities have been asked to do. That started at a global level through the OECD. That's now mandated here in Australia as well, but now it's going to become public, and they're going to be required to disclose these things publicly. At the same time, there has been a voluntary code that the Board of Tax has been promulgating, I guess, or promoting for a number of years since 2016. And the board's actually looking at what it does now in the context of the other reporting regimes that now exist and are emerging, such as that country by country reporting. So that applies to sort of large multinationals, but there are other kinds of operators people who aren't as large, who operate cross-border, who may go, well, what should I be doing in this space as well? And the voluntary code needs to adjust to try and speak to that too.
And actually, in Australia, we also have some public reporting, at least of tax paid, that the commissioner is required to release the information, and the size of the business for that reporting has been coming down over time. Something that the ATO does that tax people know about, but others may not, is it has a kind of a red, amber, green risk assessment process as well. And I wonder whether something like that, given that this is about risk. Okay. We might move on to Brad and then come back to that. We might have a look at your mic, Rosemary, while we're doing that. So I forgot when I was introducing Brad that he's also going to be co-teaching a new subject, I think it is in the Masters, called Global ESG and Construction Projects. Or projects?
Close enough.
Close enough.
Close enough.
Right. So we're moving a little bit into the construction and environment space, but more generally still sustainability. Thanks, Brad.
Thanks, Miranda. And if I can just tag on to the question you had moments ago, that the construction industry is really familiar with environmental management systems and safety systems. So on one level, they are better prepared than others, but the purpose with which reporting will be very different from those systems. So I think the challenge for the construction industry and development sectors more generally is to really think about how they're going to communicate differently with a different kind of audience, and who it might be that does that work. That it may not necessarily be an OH&S expert that does that, but you might need to have someone with a legal background doing that work, or someone with a more corporate law background doing that work. Thank you, Miranda, and I extend the thanks to Wayne and to Matthew here, and Rosemary Langford, who is not here, for inviting me to be here and to represent, I suppose, your interests on this panel. If you've come late, I'm Brad Jessup. I'm a senior lecturer here. I'm the Director of Sustainability, and as Miranda said in your introduction, I run the Sustainability Business Clinic in partnership with the law firm Ashurst, and we're setting up a new clinic, a climate resilience clinic, in partnership with Ashurst, White & Case, and Lander & Rogers. And in those contexts, we're engaging with questions around climate and sustainability. And the subject I'm teaching is with Robert Reid from King's College in London. I approach questions of sustainability and ESG a bit differently from others on the panel. Rather than the boardroom or the regulation, I generally do so from the ground. And so if I can indulge myself, I think, rather than you, I want to quickly talk to you about a couple of projects that I've got going right now that speak to, I suppose, some of the data gaps that exist around sustainability reporting. So I'm involved in a project that is a collaboration between social scientists, lawyers, ecologists, and community groups, trying to connect human values with ecological and therefore economic values centered around the Bay. So for instance, we're trying to understand what might be an indicator for environmental health viewed through human interests in the environment. So on one hand, you've got human interests, on the other hand, you've got ecological interests and economic value, and trying to get what the connecting points are. As an aside, for those of you who are dog lovers, what our early data is pointing towards that beaches where you can have dogs on lead are really good indicators of ecological health. So some surprising findings, but we're trying to work out how we can map sort of the E or the S of ESG through the human engagement with the environment. I'm also doing a work in collaboration with EPA relating to their new environmental justice policy, again looking at indicators. So rather than simply looking at the traditional environmental justice indicator, which is socio and economic disadvantage, looking at health indicators or climate restoration indicators. And those indicators proposed to be used by the EPA in their decision making around approvals of projects. So they're data gaps, or they're trying to fill data gaps, I suppose, out there in our ESG reporting framework. All right, so what I want to talk about are three things, or at least raise three issues for us to think about. The first is to make the point that much of the construction industry will be subject to mandatory reporting over the near term, and what that might mean for climate matters, but what it also might mean around nature-based reporting, the next stage of sustainability reporting that might be coming our way. And because it is in that construction context, I think we can learn more about what nature-based harm might look like. Second, I make the point that sustainability reporting may be a proxy for or an alternative to regulatory reforms, and I'm open to counter views on that point. And third, I want to mention that beyond the reporting domain, the social of ESG, especially concerning community engagement and the expectations of traditional owner partnership with respect to development projects, is only going to increase and need greater attention over the near term. So that first point about the intersection of construction projects, construction law, and sustainability and sustainability reporting, I do want to call out the work of the students already mentioned by Miranda, Benjamin, Matthew, Pinadu, and Samuel, who put together a report that have researched the applicability of the new sustainability or climate reporting standards on various actors in the construction industry. And indeed, the most significant actors in the industry, principals, contractors, but also consultants, will be required to report, including about emissions and their targets. And this, I think, is really important for the reporting system more generally by corporate Australia, because it's the behaviour of the development sector by construction developments, and that will be also reported by the financial sector, that will start to build our data through developments on the ground that can be then reported by others within the ecosystem of reporting requirements. All those involved in the construction industry that will be subject to reporting requirements over time will need to report all of their Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. So we're getting a deeper level of data and a more relevant data set in that context. And thereafter, we anticipate that they will shift or allocate co-responsibilities for that data to either others upstream or downstream, both in supply or production. Within that little clinic that I do, we've been approached by the UN Compact to try to break down what these reporting requirements might be for small businesses who exist within those sort of streams of work, especially those businesses that might be able to create opportunities in that place as being forward-looking, nature positive or climate positive businesses. The reporting obligations are not simply about quantifying environmental impacts, though. There are qualitative reporting obligations that Rosemary mentioned too, much more about risk approaches and environmental governance models. And this takes me to my second point, that an appropriate governance framework should or perhaps must be a best practice standard. If, as expected, the substance of sustainability broadens, the field of best practice will also potentially widen. And I say that these obligations to report on environment, climate, or nature risks means that, for example, best practice environmental laws across the country become standardised, become universal, such that Victoria's new General Environment Duty and Queensland recently amended General Environment Duty become an expectation across corporate Australia, not simply an expectation of companies within those jurisdictions. Victoria's approach to environmental justice, for instance, might also be approach that those corporations that have a footprint both in Victoria and elsewhere will need to apply across their portfolio of businesses, for instance. The progressive approach that Victoria is taking with respect to cultural heritage laws is similarly a kind of approach that may well be broadened across the country and therefore circumventing Western Australians' attempts to neuter those reforms in that jurisdiction. So to my third point, it's highly expected that the likely modest reforms coming to federal environmental laws, given the re-election of our federal government, will at least include new Australian environmental standards. So there will also be things that will need to be subject to reporting under future reporting regimes, either under that Federal Environmental Act or under climate and sustainability reporting more generally. There have been indications and commitments made by this government, both before it was in government and last time it was in government, to reposition traditional owner and other community group interests within the development assessment process, such that while there may not be an obligation to report on First Nations justice or engagement, there'll be expectations and standards set about how that should occur in order to assure the federal government that it has been done. The Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure offers some insights and recommended guidance on engagement of Indigenous peoples, local communities and affected stakeholders. And they focus on matters that might be difficult to report, but are expected in practice. Listening, understanding knowledges that are not necessarily conventional, maintaining livelihoods, restoring ecosystems, encouraging use of landscapes and sharing benefits. And so how those things get either quantified or discussed in a qualitative way, I think is a really exciting thing to look forward to over the next few years.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Brad. And it's really great to have that another area of law about which I know embarrassingly little. So I'm learning a lot on this panel, the environmental law at its state level effect. And from what you said, just so that I understand it properly, you're suggesting that, for example, in the construction sector, where you've got these many different sizes of businesses, a lot of small contractors moving into the big ones, you get a kind of reporting down feeding that the larger businesses are going to require the smaller ones to give them some information to align. And then you also have some feeding of this sort of thing under the EPA or whatever into the bank financial reporting and then into a broader. Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, there's these wonderful networks and cascading that's going to be happening, if it isn't already happening, between those related entities in a commercial sense, but also in a actual sense, the way that they work together. And we should expect, because this has been the experience elsewhere, that for those organisations, there are many construction businesses that have footprints across states, that is just simply easier to adopt the best standard in that jurisdiction and apply across their frameworks.
So you get this best practice effect
Correct.
as well,
Sort of flows
potentially.
over. And then if the data, particularly of the construction industry, gets fed up to the financial industry, then there's a chance that that also gets shared as well. So there's this wonderful moment, I think, where we have a plurality and complexity of standards, and we don't quite know where it's going to go.
So Andrew maybe has a comment.
I have a question.
You've got a microphone, I hope, still working on.
It's still working, hopefully. The interaction of different parts of the law, I guess, when you're talking about the construction industry reporting on scope 1, 2, and 3. But I'm interested how you see that's likely to play out. And in New South Wales, for example, there is a policy directive to consent authorities in relation to taking into consideration net zero obligations. And so how do you see a consent authority being able to take into account this kind of information, I guess, and the expectation that might be put upon the construction industry, as one example, to provide that information? Presumably, it's not just going to result in certain projects just stopping, that mitigation might be part of the solution. How is this all going to play out? Because we actually have several different arms of law all converging, it seems to me.
Yeah. So right now in Victoria, and I think Victoria stands alone, those things must be considered, though conventionally they are not considered under our Climate Change Act. Their obligations in order to make us consider climate change. The way that it does work out is around offsets and net zero or net gain. And I think, again, some learning can be fed up from the development of the construction industry about especially how they work on offsetting within the native vegetation arena. So I think we'll see that much more as a concept that doesn't simply work with nature, but also works with carbon and other aspects of sustainability. I don't think we should imagine for any moment that this sustainability turn or even reporting turn will lead to anything changing within our sort of development approvals process in terms of what we see as by outputs. It may well be that we now have much more information at hand, which means we make much more educated decisions around development approvals and how those harms can be mitigated in some sort of way. And we see that in Victoria's environmental justice policy, they're very much focused on restoration. So that's what we'll likely see. They'll be saying, yes, you can do this thing, provided you fix this thing, or at the end, you restore this thing and back to how it was. So that idea of, that net no long impact, I think, is going to be something that we see much more of.
It may also promote innovation, it seems to me.
Yeah.
So that comes back, Rosemary, to you raised the point about reporting being backwards looking somewhat or lagging, these lagging indicators, but some of the things Brad's suggesting seem to be looking forward, that actually you, as almost as part of your reporting, and then perhaps in different sectors, your approval and consent processes for future activity builds in what you reported, and are you fixing this, or ideally we make those links stronger. Did you have a view on that? I'm going to give you my microphone just to...
No, it's all right. It was my bad. I had turned it off not to interfere with other speakers. So yeah, absolutely. And the idea is that you're creating those feedback loops, and I think we will see the evolution of kind of practice or management approaches, not dissimilar to what we do with financial and accounting, where we have our financial management system from which we pull decision useful information, whether it's at the project level or the management level or the board level, or to report out to the world. And in fact, some colleagues and I were involved in developing the SDG impact standards for enterprises, for private equity and for bond issuers, and a lot of the substance of that has been picked up by the International Standards Organization in the ISO UNDP guidelines for positive contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. And that is really worth a look, even as a gap analysis initially, but to see how do you start to frame up that kind of approach. And I think part of what Brad is talking about also is there's this whole sustainability context in which you're operating, and I think that irrespective of how companies are reporting about the particular risks and opportunities for them, it's going to be harder and harder to actually get to an accurate picture or a defensible picture of that, unless companies build now a much more complete picture of the sustainability context in which they're operating.
And am I right to assume all this reporting is public? Is that right? The sustainability, this just shows or is it all just to a regulator? The Sustainability and Standard Board, does it all have to be included in public statements?
Yes.
Yeah.
ASIC requires that as part of the reporting.
So it'll be with the suite of your normal financial reports. So the same way directors sign off on their financial reports and their auditor statements. So it will be it's a fourth report that is part of that suite now.
Yeah, I guess, and that raises a whole interesting question about to what extent things start to get better integrated and you start move to integrated reporting.
Because it seems like a lot of layers.
Yeah, well, I think people are concerned that some of the reports that they've seen in past years by various companies that run to hundreds of pages really needs to come back to something that's more digestible.
Yeah. On that note, we're right at the end. I'm going to give each of ours, perhaps come back to you, Rosemary, first, final remarks, and then the others, and then we'll close.
Yeah, I think this is the beginning of the story, and what we will see over the coming years will be quite a bit of disruption. It'll be messy, but I think the promise is that the availability of data combined with the availability of tech, the shifting of values, not least with generational change, that we will see not only more information, but the capacity to utilise that in different ways that does shift norms, that in turn hopefully makes policymakers a bit braver. And the importance of things like the law and the way that we think about these issues in the context of practice also, I just want to say I think is hugely important, because as things fragment and people start to polarize around different issues, the roles of corporate law, of the way that that's practiced, of the and of the way that things also get reported and the data gets used in the ways that help to maintain some of the fabric of the things that we care about as society is hugely important. So I think this is it's a bigger shift. It's going to be a trigger for bigger shifts in a whole range of areas.
So I've been confused about whether it's an evolution or a revolution, whether it's temporary or permanent. I mean, it seems like it's permanent. Are you an optimist? Sounds like
I'm an
this is a
optimist
good
because I don't like
development.
the alternative.
The alternative's bad.
The alternatives are worse. But I think it's an evolution in the prosaics around the reporting, but that is part of a bigger revolution and disruption that's going on.
Yeah. And Andrew, well, first of all, are you an optimist, or these the regulators? So, you know.
Well, I'm not, yeah,
Not quite the
not quite the
regulator.
regulator, the standard setter, perhaps. I'm struck perhaps as to where we are going as much as where we are now. And in New Zealand, they've started a project around Te Maori, and the way in which the Maori-based organisations in particular don't look at reporting for for the 12 months that just finished, but rather reporting for the next 100 years or 200 years. So they have a very, very long time horizon. And the current reporting regimes don't deal with that, don't answer that. And similarly, I look at the kind of impact reporting that's emerging. In public sector, there's certainly more in relation to that. In the private sector, we see the International Accounting Standards Board talking about management commentary and more detail that sits outside your normal standard kind of reporting framework. So this is the beginning, in a sense, of a much broader range of reporting that's actually going to really give some rich information, I think, to communities.
Thank you. And Brad, you seem to me to be an optimist. You've got 10 seconds for the last word.
My last words, given that we're at a university, I think this is a really important area of legal development that should remind our students about the need to have multiple literacies as they approach the law, that law is no longer siloed as it was. And so you need to have a grasp of environmental law, or of corporate law, or of construction law to be an effective lawyer out there in the real world.
Thank you for that ad for the Melbourne Centre for Commercial Law, trying to bring all these things together. Thanks everybody for joining us. Sorry to be a little late. If you'd join me in thanking our panel.